Hello, I'm Chai Hoffelenia. Joining us today in the Rappler studio is Raymond Fortun, legal counsel for petitioner Greco Belgica against the pork barrel issue. On Tuesday, the Supreme Court had its first hearing of oral arguments on the constitutionality of lawmakers' Priority Development Assistance Fund, or PDAF. Lawyers of the petitioners took the podium and urged the Supreme Court justices to strike down the congressional and presidential pork barrel for violating separation of powers and checks and balances. The arguments concluded with Justice Sereno saying petitioners must establish a constitutional basis for the court to intervene. Attorney Fortun will share his insights into how the oral arguments could play out. Good afternoon. We're happy that you could join us in the studio today.
Thanks, Chai. It's a pleasure being here.
Yes. Yesterday it was a long hearing, more than 5 hours.
Yes, it was.
What were your quick reactions after the hearing? Did you feel good?
It's very easy to say that we did our part.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because simply from the questions that the justices propounded, it's obvious that we had definitely gotten their attention, that they had done their homework, that they had their own opinions about it as well, some of them expressing out loudly, somehow already giving a hint of how they will be voting. But by and large, we saw a lot of participation by the justices, and that was a good sign because that means that they are interested, and that obviously we're going to come out with a decision by 15 of the brightest minds in this country, and that will always be a good thing, whether win or lose.
Could I backtrack a bit and just retrace with you how you got drawn into this issue? Because I know that the last high-profile case that you were involved in was Serendra, of course, and I know you're also into wedding photography. So what brought you into the PDAF issue? Yeah,
one of the petitioners in the main petition is Attorney Jose Malvar Villegas of the Citizens Crime Watch. And Attorney Villegas is one of our clients. So when the petition was filed and there was a temporary restraining order issued subsequently, Attorney Villegas immediately asked us to at least represent him during the oral arguments before the Supreme Court.
And was this something that you were eager to get involved in?
Anything of national importance, so lawyers will always find this momentous, especially a case of this magnitude where the results would certainly be felt probably 20, 30 years from now. The issue of the PDAF has been festering for some time. Even as early as 1997, you had already questions raised before the Supreme Court on whether the pork barrel, as it were, then called the Community Development Fund, or the CDF, was in fact constitutional. So you can see that there was already, even as early as that time, the mindset of certain citizens that there was a possible abuse that could be created because of the amount of funds that were now being made available for at the discretion of the congressman. So there was a decision made by the Supreme Court. It just basically, because of the issues propounded, merely just said, well, the CDF is an innovative kind of structure or funding by the congressman in order to cater to the needs of its constituencies on a district level basis. And so there is at least a very clear, as far as the Supreme Court was concerned, at least a delineation that the CDF is just merely a passage of a law where there is now a disbursement of funds, nothing more. Now, the thing is that subsequent to that, there was a second challenge. This was in 2004, I believe, the Lamp versus Secretary of the Budget. And in that case, there was now a very clear assertion by the petitioners in that case that there was definitely abuses going on and how the PDAF, as it now was now being called, was being utilized by the congressman. It's something that's pretty much an open secret. You have
But-
congressmen getting money, deciding which
Yes.
particular projects they're going to engage in, and then somehow getting a certain portion of that and pocketing
But
it.
what's interesting here, though, is like also from yesterday's questions, there is a line of thinking that goes that this might be a political issue rather than a constitutional question, and therefore maybe the Supreme Court might not be the right venue for it. And I think Justice Sereno was headed in that direction.
Well, it may be construed as a political issue if the issue being raised is one which would involve the wisdom in the passage of this particular law. The problem is that the petitioners have in fact very wisely sidestepped that. No, in fact, just went beyond that and just categorically stated that the issue is not one of the wisdom of the passage of the law, but the constitutionality, meaning the legality of the law itself.
Mm-hmm.
So that issue now being overcome because of the allegations in the petition itself, it now behooves upon the Supreme Court now to pass upon this in the exercise of its power of judicial review.
I think one of the main issues that struck those who've been following this particular issue is the separation of powers.
Yes.
Why is it that legislators are involved in the implementation of projects when this is supposed to be part of the executive's powers? Is this one of the points that you want to pursue or push?
Yes, most definitely. I'll make it pretty simple now.
Mm-hmm.
There are three main branches of government.
Yeah.
The first one is the executive branch, which is basically the president and the cabinet secretaries and all the agencies under him. Department of Justice, the Department of Public Welfare and Public Welfare. The Department of Social Welfare and Development, the Department of Public Works and Highways, etc., etc. The different bureaus under it. So under the Department of Finance, there would be the BIR and so forth. Now, the second branch is the legislative branch. Now, this would be Congress itself. You have the Senate and the House of Representatives. And then lastly, you have the judicial department, which is the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, regional trial courts, and the municipal trial courts. They all have, under our Constitution, very clear, and I stress this, very clear guidelines on what their powers are. What are the powers? Simple. Congress is to enact laws, to revise laws, and to repeal laws. It does nothing but what we call legislate, meaning to make laws, whether to create new ones, to amend the old ones, or just totally to obliterate or to just revoke any that is deemed to be unconstitutional or no longer proper. Then you have now the executive branch, which just executes, meaning whatever laws that are passed by Congress, the President just follows and complies with. Now, one of the laws that are normally complied with is what we call an appropriation law. Okay? And in our system, it is called the General Appropriations Act. Now, under their Constitution, once Congress convenes, usually middle of July, you will notice it's this big affair where you have all the congressmen and senators being dressed up in really good clothes, and then you have the president speaking in front of them. Within 30 days after that, then they now start deliberating on the budget for the next year.
Right.
Why is there a need for a deliberation on the budget? Remember that it is Congress who has to allocate funds so that the government will function for next year. It's as simple as that. Think of it like a husband and wife, where you have the husband being the breadwinner.
That's very
Trying to-
sexist.
Okay,
No,
I'd
I'm
like to
just
think of it
kidding.
that way. Okay, you have the husband being the breadwinner,
All right.
and that's usually general structure. So the husband brings home the bacon, brings in the money, and what does the husband do? Which some people will say is sexist as well. The husband turns over all the money to the wife, and the wife decides what to spend, how it will be spent, but only in accordance with what the husband says should be spent and what particular things should be bought. It's as simple as that. It cannot be like the husband saying, here's all the money, bahala ka na. You can do whatever you want with it. That's not how it works in government. So you have the legislature in the persona of the husband saying, this is the money, utilize and use it wisely. This is how I want you to spend it for the entire year. 10% on this, 10% on that, 10% on roads, 10%. Okay, in a family, it would be like 10% for rice, 10% for meat, for veggies, for whatever other personal effects, and so forth.
Yeah.
Everything has a specific purpose. And what does the wife do in such a case? The wife just merely executes, just does it. So in the government sense, the executive is like in the persona of the wife. The wife gets the money, spends it or utilizes it according to the wishes of the husband. As simple as that.
Yeah.
Now, what happens in the PDAF or in this particular case? Okay, I'll if that is a delineation, as it were.
Yeah.
If anybody tries to go and cross these limits, then you have a problem. Because in a family sense, the wife is going to say, why are you making pakialam? Why are you fiddling with the money that you gave me? Your job is just to give me the money. My job is to spend it. All right? On the other hand, the Congress, the husband's job is to check once in a while whether the monies are actually being spent properly. In like manner, remember that there can be no money given to the wife unless the wife comes up with a budget. The wife has to say, honey, I need this amount of money, otherwise we're all going to starve.
And this is what you need to fund.
Yes. So that's why the husband has to go look for a job which would be equal to what are the needs of the family based on the budget given by the wife. Simple as that. So if anybody tries to cross the line there, then you now have a problem. In now a government sense, under the structure of government that we have, legislature gives the money and defines what projects to implement for the following year. President just executes, nothing more.
But let me bring it back concretely to the issue of PDAF, because the family budget is quite different from PDAF. Yes, sure, there are similarities, but yeah, there are also political realities. So, for example, they would say that if you left, yes, there are constitutional limits, and the Constitution has clear separation of powers and all that.
Yes.
But if you left everything to the executive branch, or there's just one group that decides on how the money will be used, then you don't have a system of checks and balance in place.
Oh, certainly, precisely. That is what the point is all about. Because the Congress has to be the one to say, this is the money and these are the projects that I want you to do. See, the president has absolutely no discretion on how the money is going to be used. If we're talking of a situation where Congress just goes, okay, here's the money, bahala ka na. Then you now have an unbridled power given to the president to decide how the money is going to be spent, how much money for each particular project or activity or whatnot, and even decide what needs to be paid or not. Like, for example, I'd like to impeach a Supreme Court Chief Justice. Maybe I can use that money to try to get the decision that I want. You see, now you have a problem, because definitely the amount which had been given by Congress is now being used for purposes which was different from what it was intended to be. That is when it becomes unconstitutional. So it all starts from the basic premise. Congress has the money, gives it to the executive, but Congress also has the obligation to define which particular projects have to be implemented for the year. So the president has no say. The president just merely goes ahead and executes according to what is decided by Congress to be implemented and the amount of money that has been given therefore.
So essentially, you're saying that congressmen should not have any say whatsoever in how the money should be spent and even who should be implementing these projects.
Definitely.
And we saw that in the COA report, which
Yes.
was quite problematic.
Exactly, because under the law, in fact, under the General Appropriations Act, the role of Congress is limited to one, defining the projects, and two, defining the implementing agency. The implementing agency meaning the branch of the executive
Which
branch.
particular department?
Right, whether it's the DPWH, whether it's the DepEd, whether it's the Department of Health. That's it. It ends there. The problem here is now you see congressmen going beyond what we call post-legislation acts. The job of Congress should end once that the law is passed.
Right.
That is the line drawn on the sand. If Congress, any congressman now continues to do certain acts after the law is passed, you now have a clear violation of the separation of powers. So you have it there. You see congressmen and senators calling implementing agencies, government-owned or controlled corporations, telling them, hey, you know, the money is here, and I'm endorsing this particular NGO to implement my project. That is actually a big no-no. That is a very clear violation of the Constitution.
But aren't you also giving the president a lot of powers, giving him a lot of discretion on how the money will be spent?
Well, not really, because remember that to begin with, that is why the General Appropriations Act must also be very defined and very clear what the projects will be and what would be the implementing agency. The presumption here is that government will function properly, meaning that there is a specific process. It's not like tipong, okay, so na-define na natin yung implementing agency and then wala na. No, once that the implementing agency has been tasked to do a particular project, there's a specific process for it. Number one, they have to come out with a notice to bid. They have to have the project bidded out. That's a requirement under our procurement law. Hindi pwede yung basta pipili na lang sila ng kung sinong kontratista or kung sino na lamang na NGO. No, they have to have it published in a newspaper. Tell them, hey guys, you know, there's this project, this is under the recent Appropriations Act. We're going to build a bridge, all right? Now, can we get all interested bidders to come in and submit your sealed bids, not later than blah, blah, blah. And then there's an opening, there's an awarding, and then all of these bidders have to comply with certain requirements, which the law itself also very clearly provides. Things like certificate of registration from the SEC, 3 years financial statements, no, showing your capability to do the work, your equipment, a list of equipment, a list of the projects, past projects that you've done. I mean, it's a very stringent process if you follow it.
Didn't the DBM try to put in certain rules, like you have to specify what projects, what particular implementing agency would be in charge of it, and then all the requirements. Aren't those sufficient guidelines or means by which you make sure that there are no abuses?
Apparently not, because as the COA report would show, that there were a lot of violations with regard to the compliance with the requirements. As I said, in the first place, designating an NGO to implement a particular project is actually, again, another violation. Why? Because there is a very clear memorandum on this, that the only time that an NGO actually can participate in the implementation of a government project is if there is what is known as an appropriation law or an ordinance which authorizes the NGOs to actually come in and participate. Otherwise, NGOs cannot and should not be allowed to participate in government projects. Now, why was it that? Way back in 2007, there appeared to have been a cultural shift, and this was mentioned by Justice Sereno. There appeared to have been a cultural shift to involve NGOs in the workings and the projects of government. But even then, you will notice that the NGOs being mentioned were really those who are bona fide, really altruistic kind. and really non-stock non-profit organizations who are there really been devoted for several years in doing nothing but public service. Okay, but once that came in, then you now had a sudden proliferation of other NGOs, now of the dubious kind.
Yeah.
And that's when the problem came in, because once you allowed one NGO to come in, then somebody smart decided that, hey, we can now come in also. And because of the previous allowance of NGOs, now you can bring in your own NGO created by and probably connected with Congressman so-and-so. And now that is where the abuse came in. Because once the legislator can now control to which NGO these funds will go, he can now also dictate how the funds are going to be used.
But one argument also is that, well, if you look at the laws, let's shift to Malampaya, for example. Okay. If you look at is it PD 910? I believe
910,
yes. There is a particular provision there touching on appropriations, which gives the president full powers,
yes.
Allowing him to decide on how funds can be used for other purposes.
Correct.
So in a sense, it's perfectly legal. It's provided for by the law. It's not illegal.
Well, yeah, it's probably perfectly legal at the time that law was passed. Let us remember that this Malampaya Fund was created during the time of President Marcos. That's why it's called PD, or Presidential Decree 910. Let's remember that Marcos at the time had full powers to legislate. In fact, that's why it's called the Presidential Decree. At that time, remember, because of martial law, he abolished Congress. And so the only person who could now enact laws was the president himself during martial law. That's why you had presidential decrees. One of the decrees, the laws that Marcos made, was PD 910. So at that time, obviously, he had the power to legislate, and he also had the power to spend the money whichever way he wanted. And so when this law was passed, sure, it was valid. The problem was that when Congress was now again created, when Cory Aquino came in, and the 1987 Constitution allowed now the creation of a new Congress, effectively, again, we go now back to what the Constitution says. Congress enacts laws and revises the laws. The executive just simply executes. Therefore, PD 910, specifically that particular provision, which allows him to basically to decide which way how the funds are going to be used, is going to be definitely in contradiction to the clear definitions and lines that are created under the 1987 Constitution.
But it's still in effect.
That's correct. That is exactly why the petitioners in this case have in fact raised PD 910 as being unconstitutional, because it granted to the president a power to utilize funds for any other purpose that he may decide, which is a violation of the Constitution. Why? Because remember, he is now the one who disburses the funds.
Right.
He has the funds, and he's the one who decides how the funds will be disbursed. Worse, he decides how the funds are going to be disbursed, what particular projects are going to be
very powerful precedent
to be used or to be created just for this purpose. And now you have a problem. You have a problem like what happened in 2009, as it would seem, where funds in Malampaya, which by its very definition is supposed to be for energy-related projects, now appears to have been channeled for the utilization by the Department of Agrarian Reform.
But
impossible.
Let me just play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
If I were the executive, if I were the president, and given how the checks and balance works here, the checks and balances system works in a democracy, sometimes Congress can be very restricting, and the president has very little maneuvering room.
Yes.
And there could be certain situations, just like what happened in Ondoy and Pepeng, when you needed funds. And it's not easy for Congress to make those funds available. And here you have Malampaya. So in that case, it was convenient. And if you have very good intentions of tapping funds, much needed funds, to be able to immediately address a problem or a need,
Yes.
then it's helpful. So it's not necessarily all that bad.
Well, as I said, okay, let's talk about the specific issue. A calamity. There is a presidential calamity fund, which is specifically earmarked and which can be drawn, the funds of which can be drawn by the president at any time in case of a calamity. In other words, there's already a fund set aside specifically to address the problems of needs for social services during times of calamity. In case that is somehow depleted or is insufficient, what can the president do? The president can ask Congress to enact a special appropriations law and have it certified as urgent, and Congress now comes out with a law and disburses a fund allocation to tackle a particular urgent need, which obviously was not yet anticipated at the time that the General Appropriations Bill was passed. So there is a mechanism even for the president, in case he's able to convince Congress of the need to pass a supplemental budget or a special appropriations law, to be able to draw funds and to utilize those funds.
Another interesting point that's been raised here is that it's realpolitik. Again, looking at the dynamics between the executive and the legislative branches of government, Congress has power over funds,
Yes.
appropriations in effect, and then the president has his own powers, as we have seen. And the president can use PDAF, for example, to make sure that legislators toe the line for him to pursue key areas of reform. And especially in this case, he says that he was running on an anti-corruption platform, and it was necessary to maybe encourage or...
When the president has a legislative agenda, maybe that's what we can call it. A legislative agenda, meaning that the president says, I need certain bills passed. I want these bills. But you see, if the bills per se are really for the good of the country, why do you need money to give us an incentive to congressmen? That is realpolitik indeed. But can't you see that by giving the president so much money in order to dangle the moolah to congressmen, you are actually creating a system of corruption. Basically, that's it. Look, again, let's go back to a family situation. You know, you have the father telling the son, I want you to have good grades. All right? Now, if you say, son, if you get good grades, I will give you an iPad. What would you call that? That's called a bribe.
Incentive, reward.
Yeah, and take a look at the definition of a bribe. It is actually giving a consideration for doing a particular act. It's a reward, a gift, in fact. It's just a matter of semantics, whether you want to call it a bribe, an incentive, or what. It is still getting something for doing something, which, by the way, you are obligated under the law to do. Congressmen are supposed to enact laws, and they're not just to enact laws, they're supposed to enact good laws for the country. So whether or not you are given a certain incentive by the president, you're going to go ahead and vote on it. You don't even have to be gifted or promised a particular consideration just to come out with it. So you see that there is a problem of corrupting the lawmakers to toe the line, as you said. And that is something which actually is again another violation of the Constitution, because by that kind of a structure, the PDAF structure, you're now preventing each branch of government in checking the powers of each, of trying to ensure that each one does its job properly. Because everybody is basically saying, I'm not gonna look at what you're doing so long as you don't look at what I'm doing. And that culture is something that we just need to put a stop to.
There's an interesting question here related to checks and balances. This is from Elinor Magbanwa. He says, Attorney, are these current events in the national leadership leading to a constitutional crisis?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so, and I certainly wish that it should not reach that point. when we speak of a constitutional crisis, we're talking of a system where the entire, when all branches of government could no longer function properly. And for that reason, the most that I can see here is that, well, the congressmen don't have the money that they used to feast upon in the past. They will not have money to give to their scholars or give out as medical assistance, which is also in a way a good thing, because then the mendicancy attitude of the Filipinos, forming lines outside the congressman's doors early in the morning just so they can get money for medical expenses and whatnot, is going to be stopped.
But isn't that also part of the political reality, that if you're a congressman or even a mayor or a governor, people will come to you, ask for help because you're the most visible and closest representative of the national government?
But the problem is again, let's go back. What are congressmen elected to power for? They're there to enact laws. They're not there to look after their constituencies. The power to look after constituencies should belong to the local government officials. It should belong to the mayors, the vice mayors, the executive branch itself. It should belong to the Department of Health with regard to medical assistance. It should belong to the Department of Social Welfare and Development if it pertains to some of the other social services that are provided by government. Congressmen are there to enact laws. And that's what it should remain. That is what the petitioners are demanding. Ang trabaho ng congressman ay gumawa ng batas, hindi para magmudmud ng pera, hindi para magpa-scholar, hindi para magbigay ng medical assistance sa mga mahirap. The problem kasi is that when the money is in their hands, and I've heard this so many times, makikita mo, tatawagin yung tao, scholar kita, ito, bibigyan kita ng 2,000, kunwari daw, binigyan kita ng 10,000. Ang dali-dali because all the money is there and nobody is checking it. Why? Because it's PDAF.
It engenders political patronage.
It even engenders a situation where only those who are aligned, yes, with the power that be is the one who is being given. One sitting senator claims that during the time of the previous administration, he did not get a single PDAF. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why he asked for more during this recent issue about the DAP. Sabi niya, dapat hindi lang 50 million yung akin kasi nung panahon ni Tutut, payat na payat ako, gutom na gutom ako, so dapat doble yung akin. Take a look. In fact, indeed, that sitting senator actually got twice what the others got.
Who is he?
Can just check the records. seems to be currently involved with a movie star, I think. And
okay.
It's not Sharon. Anyway.
We can talk later.
Right.
Okay. There's another question here from @Richfield J. Considering the PDAF and DAP scandals, how do you see the Philippine government 5 years from now?
Well, if we remove the PDAF, that means that Congress is going to start doing its job. Specifically, you're now going to see number one, you're going to see a lot of congressmen being actively involved during the budget process. Guys, you go to Congress during the budget deliberations now, practically nobody's there.
Yes.
Nobody cares. Because there's only one thing that is important for them, the bottom line. How much is my PDAF? How am I going to get mine in? That's all they're concerned about. Now, but because they don't have a PDAF, now what happens is that you now have each congressman just scrutinizing the budget like hounds, which is what it should be, which is what is happening in the United States. You have everybody involved taking a look. Oy, baka sumusobra na yung mga proyekto mo, and so forth and so on. Oy, teka, bakit 50 million yung allocation mo yan? Napakamahal naman yung road na yan. You see, everybody now gets involved. So what happens now? Number one, we get a lot of savings. You're not gonna need a lot of money for coming out with a yearly budget. Number two, you now have the executive just so hog-tied with a very detailed budget that it's going to be very difficult for a realignment or a movement of funds like what this DAP is all about. Why? Hindi na pwede yung mga projects na hindi na i-implement and now, which will now be quote-unquote be considered as savings. Now everybody's going to be interested in having their projects moving. Now you have the national government, the executive branch now suddenly riddled with questions. What is happening with my with my project? What is happening with this and that? Because now Congress, the congressmen are now going to be very, very precise in saying, I want whatever I got really to go to my constituents. Unlike now where it appears that they're only interested in getting the money.
You take out the incentive to run for Congress.
Oh yeah, that's the common joke right now. No, that once this PDAF is abolished, you're going to see less and less people running for Congress because it's not going to be worth it. Now you're going to see the congressmen really doing their jobs, and that's a good thing.
Another point that has been raised is on the issue of abuse of discretion. Do you think this is also a strong argument for abolishing or getting rid of PDAF?
Okay, I'll give this very clear example, and this was asked of COA Chairman Grace Pulido-Tan yesterday. The Chief Justice showed a slide of the PDAF through the years. It would appear, remember that the COA report was during the period 2007 to 2009. Now, based on the slide, it would appear that during that same period, the total amount of PDAF that should have been released to congressmen and senators was only something roughly about 50 billion pesos.
Yeah.
Okay? Grace Pulido-Tan in her report said that the PDAF released during that same period actually was 100 billion. How did that happen? And that was the question that was propounded by the court. Remember, again, we go back. There can be no funds that can be released unless it was allocated by way of the budget. Now, the budget for PDAF for 2007 to 2009 was only 50 billion pesos, and yet the COA itself found 100 billion in releases. Clearly a grave abuse of discretion. We're talking about 50 billion pesos. Amazing. I mean, if that amount is not sufficient for the Supreme Court to describe as a grave abuse of discretion, then, the standards are really going to be so high now.
But you have Justice Carpio saying yesterday that it's unconstitutional on its face.
You don't need a COA report to prove
Yeah.
it, but at least on the argument of grave abuse of discretion, the facts will speak for itself. All you had to do is just mention that, in the first place, take a look at the COA report. You're going to see, as Chairman Tan said, there's going to be at least 6,000 notices of disallowance to be sent to all of these congressmen. Anong ibig sabihin nun? 6,000 letters showing that there were 6,000 projects that were not supported by any documentation, or probably was misused, or they could not locate it, or that the receipts are not supported, does not support what came out, or something else. The bottom line is that the COA said, hindi namin makita yung dahilan bakit lumabas itong perang ito, and therefore, these projects are not allowed. You return the money to us. And that's horrible.
What does this show us about the quality of our officials and our leaders?
The problem is really it's, as we said, it's a systems failure. Alam mo, if the systems were working, you have a system of checks and balance. You have a COA that really is nakatutok, no? Is really, really looking out for these kinds of anomalies. People are going to be more honest. You know, it's no different from a classroom during in a finals exam. If you have a proctor who is really going to snatch your paper if you're cheating, you're not going to cheat. It's as simple as that. But if you have a proctor who is, lackadaisical, labas ng labas, yosi ng yosi sa labas, then it breeds an atmosphere of cheating. Why? Because people are going to say, this is not enough, I haven't studied enough, I need to cheat. And that is what this has been happening for the past several years.
So do we have a culture of cheating?
Well, the sampling was only 2007 to 2009, and this is documented. We've known for some time that there were a lot of anomalous transactions going on in this government, and what we now have is clear proof, at least prima facie proof, that these anomalies are actually documented. And that's why the COA is coming in to document all of these transactions.
We have another question from social media. This is from Rian Santos. At Rian Santos 10 asks, or she says, good to see Attorney Fortune again. Who's funding their cause and who's behind this? Is it pro bono?
Oh, I'm doing this pro bono. I'm doing this for country.
Okay. And then, yes, there was also a point yesterday which goes, the PDAF is a circumvention of the power of the president to veto line items.
Yes.
And this is also a very valid point. Now, what do you think is your strongest argument that you can cite when if you say you want to make a point about PDAF being unconstitutional? What's your best and strongest argument?
Most definitely, the violation of the separation of powers principle under our Constitution. Long line of decisions, I won't mention them. Very clear, Supreme Court has time and time again said the legislative branch is to just pass laws and enact laws. Executive branch is to execute the laws, to implement. Now, obviously, the PDAF is a system which allows, because of the law itself, which allows the congressman now to be part of the implementation process. Clear violation of law.
Okay, maybe just a last point, where I think there are 2 more hearings that are scheduled on...
at least on Thursday.
October 10?
That's tomorrow, yes.
And on the 7th, next week, the
think
week
so,
after, I
yes.
believe. Where do you think this is all headed?
It's really difficult, and it might be improper for me to come out with a prediction on this. The most that I can say is that the petitioners have already raised their arguments. Tomorrow, you can expect the government, the respondents, to give their own point of view about this. They will assert that at least from what I've read...
What do you expect?
The President, the Office of the Solicitor General's, to my mind, based on the pleadings, already written off PDAF, meaning the congressional pork barrel. Their argument is solely that that the 2 branches of government should be left alone in order to deal with and to correct the problems of the system. Okay? Number 2 is that the OSG, the Solicitor General, representing the Chief Executive, has said, don't touch the presidential pork barrel, that's legal. All right? And then number 3, the Solicitor General, representing the congressmen, have said, is it possible that regardless of whether this pork barrel system is declared as unconstitutional or not, can you lay off on that portion which allows us to give benefits to our scholars and to provide medical assistance to the indigent families? So those are the 3 things we expect from tomorrow. Not too sure, in fact, if there's going to even be a need for a 3rd hearing on October 17.
So it's possible that tomorrow's hearing would be the last?
Yes, I expect it to be very short, simply because the arguments or the positions raised by the Solicitor General was not as extensive as those raised by the petitioners. No? So I would think it won't run the 5-hour course that happened yesterday.
Okay, thank you very much. This is something to look forward to. I think people will be watching tomorrow. By the way, we would like to correct what we said earlier. We said earlier that Attorney Fortune represents Jose Malvar Villegas. No, you represent Jose Malvar Villegas.
That's correct.
Earlier, we said that you represented Petitioner Greco Belgica,
Yes.
Attorney Samson Alcantara, and Pedrito Nepomuceno, when it's supposed to be just Mr. Malvar Villegas.
That's
okay,
correct.
so we just wanted to correct that. Thank you very much, and we hope that we would have a good hearing tomorrow. Thank you for joining us and sharing
You're
your
welcome.
thoughts and your expertise.
Thank you.
Good day.